It started with something as simple as a favor. My brother had called me one evening, asking if I could spend a little time with his childhood friend, Daniel, who had just arrived in the city for a short visit. "He doesn't know many people here," my brother explained, "and I think he'd enjoy your company. Just take him around, show him a few places if you can." I had no reason to say no. My brother rarely asked me for anything, and Daniel seemed harmless enough from what little I knew. The first time I met him, I immediately noticed how comfortable he was in his skin. Confident, but not arrogant, with this calm demeanor that made conversations effortless. He greeted me with a warm smile, and from the start, he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. There wasn't any charm that felt forced. Just someone who listened, laughed, and asked thoughtful questions. Over the next few days, we ended up meeting more often. He had this easygoing way of slipping into my schedule. Whether it was grabbing coffee or just walking in the park, he made the time pass quickly. I didn't think too deeply about it. I kept reminding myself that I was doing this for my brother. I also noticed something else. Daniel was guarded. He never spoke in depth about his personal life, especially not about relationships. I figured he was private, and I respected that. Still, there were moments he'd let something slip, an offhand comment about feeling disconnected from the people in his life, or how much he missed having real conversations. I started to enjoy our time together more than I should have. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even welcome at first. But the way he made me feel heard and seen, it had been a while since someone did that without needing anything in return. One afternoon, he told me about how he and my brother had been inseparable as kids. There was something honest in the way he spoke, and I could tell he wasn't trying to impress me. That made it worse, in a way, because I was beginning to realize I looked forward to seeing him. I began dressing up just a little more when we met, smiling a little longer than necessary, laughing at things that weren't that funny. But even then, I told myself it was nothing. Just innocent moments stretched into comfort. I didn't know that every casual conversation, every harmless glance, was pushing me closer to a line I couldn't even see yet. And the worst part? I didn't want to admit how much I was starting to care. Not to my brother. Not to Daniel. Not even to myself. Daniel and I started meeting more often, and what began as occasional meetups turned into daily routines. He'd message me mid-morning with a simple "coffee later," and I'd always say yes, without hesitation. I knew I was making space for him in ways I hadn't intended. The conversations became more personal. He told me about his work, his doubts, and one evening, he opened up about his relationship. He said it felt hollow lately, like the closeness they once shared was gone. "It's like we live side by side, not together," he said quietly. I listened, unsure of what to say, feeling caught between sympathy and something deeper I didn't want to name. He never complained aggressively, never painted her as the villain. That almost made it worse. It made him seem real, like someone who was trying, someone who wanted to be understood. I felt a shift in myself. I started anticipating his texts. I'd get restless if I didn't hear from him. I tried to justify it, telling myself I was just being a friend. But deep down, I knew it was more. There was something intimate in the way we talked, even in silence. His eyes would linger, and I wouldn't look away. The tension was growing, and neither of us dared to acknowledge it. One evening, we sat on the balcony while the sky turned dark, and he asked me what I wanted from life. I answered honestly for the first time in a while. I told him I wanted to feel chosen, not out of convenience, but because someone truly saw me. He looked at me like he understood. Too well. The pause that followed was heavy. It wasn't what he said next, but how he looked at me, like I was exactly what he'd been missing. There was no touch, no kiss. But everything in that moment screamed of closeness that shouldn't have existed. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded myself who he belonged to. But I didn't. I stayed. And the more I stayed, the harder it became to act like we were just friends. I started feeling guilty. Every time my brother asked if Daniel was doing okay, I felt like I was lying. And I was. Not with words, but with silence. With omissions. I had crossed something already, an emotional line. The worst kind, because it wasn't visible. I began questioning myself constantly. Was I just a temporary distraction for him? Was I reading too much into things? But he never made me feel like I was imagining it. He remembered little things I said, noticed when I was quiet, made me feel important in ways that no one else had in a long time. I was falling for him, and I hated myself for it. Because I knew it wasn't just wrong, it was going to cost something I couldn't get back. It happened the night he came over unannounced. He said he just needed someone to talk to, that he couldn't sleep. I let him in without hesitation, even though I already knew I shouldn't. There was something in his voice that sounded too familiar, too close. We sat quietly at first, both of us pretending everything was normal. But the silence between us wasn't comfortable anymore, it was charged. He looked tired, emotionally drained. I asked if he was okay, and he gave me this look, part pain, part apology. He said, "I don't know what I'm doing anymore, but being around you feels like the only time I'm not pretending." The words hit harder than I expected. I didn't respond. I just stared at him, trying to decide if I wanted to hear more or run from it all. One moment turned into another. His hand brushed against mine, and I didn't move away. The way he looked at me didn't leave room for doubt anymore. And still, I didn't stop it. I let it happen. The closeness, the whispered apologies, the emotional flood we had both been avoiding for days. It wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet, aching, and full of things we weren't allowed to feel. Right after, everything shifted. The warmth was gone. He got up too quickly. Said he needed air. I watched him from the window as he stood outside, pacing, head in his hands. Guilt came crashing down on me like a wave. I had never felt so ashamed. Not just for what happened, but for letting myself be fooled into believing it meant something. The next morning, he barely spoke. He didn't meet my eyes. I asked him if he regretted it. He hesitated, then said, "It was a mistake. I can't ruin everything I've built." That was the moment I knew whatever I thought we had, it was only ever temporary for him. A moment of escape, not something real. He told me his girlfriend was coming to visit, that he was going to try to fix things. He didn't say it to be cruel, but it stung worse than anything else he could have said. I realized then that I wasn't the one he wanted. I was the one he used to feel better about what he'd lost. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of him. I just nodded, pretending I understood, when inside, I was unraveling. My brother called that evening, asking why Daniel had left so suddenly. I lied. I said I didn't know. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the image he had of his friend. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. I had betrayed someone who trusted me for someone who never truly saw me. And now, I was the one left with nothing but regret. Weeks passed, and the silence between Daniel and me became permanent. He never reached out again, and I never dared to contact him. My brother eventually stopped asking about him too, assuming life had just moved on. But for me, it hadn't. I carried the weight of that night, like a secret carved into my bones. I tried to distract myself with work, friends, anything that didn't remind me of him, but everything did. A coffee shop we used to sit at, a song he once mentioned, even the time of day he used to message me. It all became reminders of how deeply I'd let myself fall for someone I could never have. The guilt didn't go away. I'd see my brother laugh with friends or talk about trust, and it would eat at me. I had betrayed not just him, but myself. I had allowed emotions to override judgment, and now I lived with the consequences. There was no apology that could fix it, no explanation that wouldn't make it worse. The worst part was knowing he had returned to his girlfriend, pretending nothing ever happened. But I couldn't pretend. I questioned everything. How I let it get that far. Why I didn't stop it. What part of me was so desperate to feel something that I ignored all the red flags. It wasn't love. I see that now. It was need, loneliness, and poor timing wrapped in the illusion of connection. I started writing everything down. Not to share with anyone, but to make sense of it for myself. I needed to see it all on paper, the choices, the consequences, the pain. It helped me realize that forgiveness wasn't going to come from Daniel or even my brother. It had to come from me. And that was the hardest part. There were days when I hated myself. Days when I'd run into people who knew Daniel and they'd mention him casually, not knowing how much damage he'd left behind. I always smiled, nodded, and kept my silence. Because admitting the truth wouldn't set me free, it would only cause more pain to others. Eventually, I learned to carry it more quietly. I focused on healing, on building something honest in my life again. Not for someone else, but for me. I set boundaries, paid closer attention to the way people made me feel, and never again mistook emotional attention for affection. What happened with Daniel taught me more than I ever wanted to learn. That betrayal doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, disguised as something beautiful. And by the time you realize the cost, it's already too late. I don't look for closure anymore. I don't need to know if he ever thinks about me or regrets what happened. All I know is that I survived it. I made a mistake, a painful one, but I faced it, learned from it, and finally let go. And that, I think, is enough.